All right. So yesterday, I finished reading Juliet, Take the Breath by Gabby Rivera. This was read in part of my gender and sexuality class. This book was published in 2019, I think, and provides a snapshot of 2003, right? So like this is historical fiction in the most modern sense of historical fiction, that is not surrounded by tragedy, right? This book is really interesting because it is a young adult novel. That's what it is at its core, and it has a lot of those kind of tropes to it, which make it kind of off-putting at times and make it kind of a little too cutesy for some of the subjects that it's covering, right? But at the same time, I think it does a really nice introduction into a lot of the themes and ideas and the exploration that would be wanted for young queer people, right? A couple things that this book really does in a really interesting way is that this book is centered around Juliet, who is a girl that has just come out to her parents and to her entire family, is Puerto Rican, is very heavily Puerto Rican, and comes from New York, and then goes on an internship with Harlow. I don't know if Harlow is based on anyone specifically, but Harlow is like the traditional image of what like a second wave feminist looks like. White, middle class, lives in Portland, but is also very focused on feminism and sexuality through menstrual cycles and what that means, right? That's really what her main driving point is. And to Juliet, who is not someone who has grown up in a society that expresses feminism in this way, it's a brand new idea, and therefore she's very, very intrigued by it. But what Juliet eventually comes to find out after working with Harlow and being in Portland and being around all the people that she meets in Portland is that this brand of feminism is not her brand of feminism. Really, in reality, Juliet's brand of feminism is fairly similar to like third and fourth wave. But yeah, right? Because some of the things that we look at when we look at with Harlow, right? Harlow as a character is someone that inherently believes in the idea that womanhood and the struggles of being a woman in a patriarchal society is even for everyone, and therefore everyone that everyone is all sisters, and therefore the charting and the usage of menstrual cycles and birthdays becomes super important because that becomes the unifying factor of everyone, which is problematic in a couple different ways, right? Because not all women's struggles are the same, right? People are people, right? And so the struggles that Harlow faces as a white middle-class woman are not the same struggles that Juliet faces of being discriminated against, not only for her gender, and her expressed gender, but also for her race, right? Or Juliet also discriminated and discriminates herself sometimes because of the way of her body image, right? Same deal goes for Maxine, who is in Portland, is queer, but is also black, right? Right. These intersectionalities mean that the inherent struggles that people face are not the same, right? And Harlow never quite gets that. In fact, Harlow eventually starts to victimize herself when she is called out for anything, because in Harlow's mind, she can never be wrong, right? The second thing that's problematic about Harlow's ideals is that it is trans exclusionary, right? By existing in this belief that womanhood exists solely through and is connected solely through the menstrual cycle means that you are excluding women who, well, A, are trans, or B, no longer have periods or cannot have periods. And then it also excludes people from identifying as allies in that sense, right? So certainly Harlow's ideals are not perfect, and I would never fault anyone for having ideals that are faulty, right? However, I think probably the most pivotal scene comes from Harlow does a reading. The question gets asked by Zyra, and she basically asks, do your final few words at the end really make this a book that is inclusive, or is this a book that is very targeted towards white middle-class women? And Harlow uses Juliet as an example. Juliet gets up and leaves. And it's because Harlow, instead of admitting and recognizing that her idealism at that point, when the book had been written, a book called Raging Flower in the story is written, does not include and needs to be expanded upon and everything. Instead of admitting that, right, and saying, I'm this needs to be worked on, this is a first step, yada yada yada. Instead of admitting to the faults of the book, she uses Juliet as an example of why this book is actually for everyone, even though it's not, right? Yeah, right. And that's a lot of the pieces that I got from this is this idea of we need to recognize that in terms of feminism and in terms of queerness, right, identity plays a huge factor. Not just identity as an individual fighting for these things, but also as an individual, what other things you identify with. And it's important to become part and have access to those types of communities that you identify with, right? Because the experiences of a middle-class white woman accepting feminism and accepting queerness are not going to be the same as someone who is accepting it later in life, right about the time they're going to college, and is inherently, or not inherently, well, is someone that is finding this out later in life and is from a completely different part of the country, from a very different background, right? All of those things form an identity that make and change the way that we view things like feminism and things like queerness, right? One of the things that is really interesting about, right, like Harlow's idealism of what feminism is to be the complete opposite of what societal standards are, right? Which makes sense, right? If you're going to say that, you know, in order to defeat the patriarchy, we need to then shift and flip all of the expectations. Well, what that does is that then excludes and eliminates people like Juliet's mom. Juliet's mom is an incredibly strong woman, an incredibly feminist woman, right? We would look at her and look at Juliet's mom and say that is the embodiment of what feminism is. Someone who raised kids and is putting themselves through college at the same time, and you know, all of that. But at the same time, Juliet's mom also irons her dad's socks. And it's the fact that she does that and plays a part as a housekeeper, does that inherently exclude her from Harlow's embodiment of what feminism is, right? And the answer is it does, right? In Harlow's idealism, the fact that Juliet's mom, despite doing all these other things, still has some sort of homemaker role, excludes her from being a feminist, which is certainly just not true, right? I guess some other things to talk about is talking about the locations that we get through this, right? We have 3 distinct locations that get brought up. We have New York and the Bronx, which is where we start at with Juliet, and then we go to Portland, and then we spend some time in Miami, right? Those are the 3 main locations. And you know, if we track the idealism of identity and community throughout, I think it's very clear, right? Because in New York, in the Bronx, with her family, Juliet has a very strong sense of community and access to knowledge, right? She's not afraid to go anywhere. She's not, you know, gives money to the homeless person that she sees every day, and she gives the man money every day, right? There's this very strong sense of community that exists there. However, there's not a strong sense of personal identity that exists there, right? She's afraid to actively act as a feminist. She's afraid to actively be queer in New York. And then we go to Portland, in which she has an incredibly strong sense of personal identity, but very little community. She's pretty isolated in the community. Right, she knows Harlow, and then she meets some other people eventually, but her sense of community is very, very broken there. It's very, very split up, but she has a very strong sense of her personal identity. And then we go to Miami, and Miami is both of these things. Juliet gets to have the ability to have a very strong personal identity while she's in Miami, but then also has a very strong community there, right? And a community that identifies with her and with her struggles, right? And so really what I think the point that Gabby Rivera is trying to make by making these three very distinct locations is showing that you need both of these things to be successful and be happy, right? You have to have both a very strong personal identity and personal acceptance, but also you have to have a community around that is willing to accept you and willing to allow you to be part of it, right? So that was really my big thing. I guess the last thing to talk about is Juliet's haircut. Juliet, while in Miami, she gets an undercut that I think is like a really big transformational scene, because I think in a very standardized way, the queerness of cutting off all your hair or getting a pretty severe undercut is a very strong queer identity that happens. I've seen a lot, especially where I am. And so I think that's part of it. But then also, I think it's a huge transformation in this idea of personal acceptance and bodily acceptance. Because Juliet gets the haircut. And part of it is that she no longer feels like she has to live up to the expectations of her mother or her family or to Harlow, right? She's allowed to be her own person. She gets the haircut, and then the people at the party want to touch her hair, and they all ask consent for it before they're allowed to touch it. But then when she goes back to Portland afterwards and Harlow sees it, Harlow immediately touches her hair without asking permission first. And there's a very it's noted that Juliet feels weird about it. Juliet also makes the connection while she's getting the haircut. She makes mention of Raging Flower and Harlow's ideas, but then also her mother's ideas, right? And she acknowledges all of these while she's getting the haircut. And I think that's all just this great big symbol of an ownership of one's own body, right? Because at its core, that's what Raging Flower, from the snippets that we get in Juliet Takes a Breath, from the snippets that we get of this book of Raging Flower, that's what Raging Flower is about. It's this bodily acceptance of who we are and what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a person, right? And becoming one with and accepting your own body, right? That's a huge part of Raging Flower. And therefore, by connecting Raging Flower to the haircut, and then the consent that is involved with the touching of the hair after the haircut, really seems to me all be encompassing of this whole idea of bodily ownership. This haircut is a symbol of Juliet becoming her own body and owning it rather than letting it be for someone else. So yeah, that is Juliet Takes a Breath. I think that is the last book for my gender and sexuality class, which is nice. Actually, I lied. There's a poetry book that's next. But yeah. Yes, Cat, I see you.